So our son Levi does this interesting thing, and something Shani and I decided a long time ago is that we would try and give our children the upbringing we didn't have by exposing them to the adventures of life. Because we obviously know the pressures of ministry for us as a family, and so every opportunity we get, we try and take our kids out of the space and we just expose them to life and adventure. And so we love traveling, going to places. We make everything an adventure, even if it's not a big deal. We'll go to the eco park and we'll call it an adventure, right? And so Levi has seen a lot, and what he does is he frames his experience a certain way, right? And he remembers certain things. But the problem is he can't always articulate or remember the account that happened, or he can't articulate the name of the place we were in. And so what he's figured out to do was he'll describe a circumstance around what happened before he tells you the story that he's trying to say. So for an example, we find ourselves in Mpumalanga, and there's waterfalls and all sorts of things, and it's beautiful. And we would think that those would be the things he remembers, the things that are grand and amazing, or the things you spend money on. Like, you better remember this, kid. It costs 300 Rand per person as an entrance fee. You're going to remember it. You are going to remember it. And yet, he wants to tell me a story of something that happened in Mpumalanga, and rather than picking the obvious big thing, he'll be like, Daddy, remember that time we were in that place when we were driving, that you stopped on the side of the road and you spoke to that man, and he gave us this, and I'm like, what? Shani's like, what? It's like, no, by that time we were at that place, and you were driving, there was this on the left, and that, and I was like, oh, in Mpumalanga. He goes, oh yeah, so in Mpumalanga, let me tell you. And so what he does is he orientates himself in order for you to see where he's going. But here's what fascinates me, is that the things that stand out to him are not the things that we thought would stand out to him on that trip. And so we're thinking, man, we went to this beautiful place, waterfalls, mountains, beautiful. And what stands out to him is that there was a moment when Dad pulled off at the side of the road and spoke to this man, and whatever it is. And so the seemingly insignificant moments are really the moments that are embedded in his heart. Which really had me thinking that what if, for you and I, throughout life, we often look for the big encounters with God. Right? The mountaintop moments. The moments like with Israel when his name was changed to Israel. Right? And subsequently led to the nation of Israel. The moments where someone had their name changed, or the moments where someone encountered God. We look for the mountaintops, but what if there are these seemingly insignificant moments where if we were to be a bit more attentive to God, that he would speak volumes from those moments. And so what ends up happening is we live our days from mountaintop to mountaintop. For some people, that's a big encounter, and then years later, another big encounter. And for some people, it's just from Sunday to Sunday. If Sunday is the mountaintop where I'm in worship and lifting my hands, then the next encounter will openly happen next week Sunday when I'm in church and I'm lifting my hands. We live from big encounter to big encounter, but what if there were just these moments where God can break into our day and encounter us in the seemingly insignificant moments of our day? Scripture is filled with people who had these encounters with God. And some of them were big, some of them were small. And what I love about these people and these encounters, they taught me something, is that they valued it enough to build an altar of remembrance around that moment. They knew that this is not often, this is not common, so I'm going to frame this and I'm going to build an altar in this moment so I can remember. Obviously, understand the context. These people were sojourners and nomads, and so they were traveling so much that all they could do was build a little altar so that as they're traveling and come back to that spot, they were like, oh, this is where God met me. Let me show you a couple of examples. Genesis chapter 8, when Noah comes back and after the account of the flood, it says, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and there sacrificed burnt offerings that the animals and birds had been approved for that purpose. And so Noah steps off this ark and is overwhelmed with the fact that, man, look at what God has done. And he just builds an altar and he says, God, something significant has just happened. Right? We see this in Abraham as he builds an altar. After so many encounters in Genesis 12, it says, then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. And so he built there an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. So in that moment when God spoke, gave him a promise, the promise hadn't come, but Abraham understood, listen, this is special. I'm going to build an altar right here. I want to remember this moment. I can come back to this and remember what God had said. Jacob, Genesis chapter 35. Then the Lord said to Jacob, go up to Bethel there and build an altar there to God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. From verse 6, Jacob and all the people who were with him came to Luz, that is to Bethel in the land of Canaan. There he built an altar and he called the place El Bethel because it was there that God revealed himself. God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. Verse 10, God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be Jacob. You will now be called Israel. And so his name was changed to Israel. What a moment. Imagine you have such an encounter with God that you leave a different person. Just for some of you, just think about this. It's one thing to look back on scripture and emotionalize it. But just imagine you leave Encounter Conference and you go home and your mom says, hey, Adam, how was conference? Like, my name shall no longer be Adam, for I am now. And so your mom's like, sorry, what? Listen, I can imagine trying that with my colored mother. My name is not Randy anymore. Hey, gaan terug en gaan haal jou naam. Don't let nonsense kom hier, Sonny. I named you, go back and fetch it where you left it. Imagine. Yet somehow, God left an imprint in some of these people's lives that was so powerful that for them, they built an altar and said, this is something I have to remember. And here's the thing, they didn't start off, we now know them as mountaintop moments, but for them, this was everyday life. That God happened to break into and just say, whoa, hang on. I'm going to do something right here, in this moment, at this time. Church, I want us to realize that our lives are sustained by these everyday encounters with Jesus. That at any given point, Jesus meets us where we're at. Some encounters are big. Some we know. We stand in church, we lift our hands, God speaks. There's a moment, tears stream down our face. We just know something special is happening. But my heart really is that we would learn that beyond these four walls on a Sunday, that we would learn how to encounter God in the everyday moments. Not the big mountaintop Sundays, but the everyday moments. That we would live by moments of encounter. Moments, these little nudges. Where in the beginning we're not sure, but we thought we heard God. And as we, like Pastor Byron and Pastor Malcolm mentioned, is as we practice, we realize that, hang on, I did hear God. But how? I'm in the dentist office. I'm at the mall. I'm at Checkers. I'm at the Home Affairs. We need the encounter there. We need encounters at Home Affairs and the traffic department. We know this. God, how is it that I just heard you here? Waiting in a line, right? Those promptings. Hey, go pray for that person. No. We only pray for people on Sundays because that's where they're expecting it. I must go across the line at Checkers and pray for God. I don't roll like that. But what if we just gave God permission to invade our day and say, if you are willing and open, you can encounter me anywhere, anytime. And see, it's these small, seemingly insignificant moments that lead to deep encounters with Jesus. These small, seemingly moments when we are just on our way. You know what I love about the accounts of the Gospels is that so often they start with, and Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. It's not like Jesus set everything aside and say, okay guys, let me show you. Come, I show you. Come, I show you what I can do in this moment. Everyone ready? Okay guys, cameras out. Peter, make sure you've got this sorted. People are going to be writing this. You write this down because people are going to be remembering. This is going to be a moment. Okay, how many fish? A couple of, okay, see ya. No. Jesus is just going about his business, doing his thing, and then suddenly there's a moment. He's on his way. He's interrupted. There's a moment. Someone sees him. Someone calls out to him. Someone pushes through a crowd. They touch him. There's a moment. He's just on his way about his business, and there's a moment. What would it look like if you and I were just so sensitive to the Spirit that no matter what happens, there's just a moment where God is like, whoa. Something's happening here. If you and I were just to be sensitive. See, here's the reason why this is so important. Now, I want to just frame this because it's one thing to have this idealistic picture that life is romantic and we drive around with gospel music playing in the back. Some of us, we wish we had the keyboard guy with us all the time where you can just, you know? And as you walk into the office, you're just like, I just feel the Holy Spirit right here in this moment. And to all my colleagues, I just want to say, if you're struggling right now, I see that hand, come on. And in the office, there's just moments of, but let's be real, life doesn't look like that. Reality, many of us find ourselves in this busy, fleeting culture where we move from one appointment to the next, right? Many of us find ourselves in this space where there are high demands placed on us. And if it were up to us, we would carve out a sufficient amount of time for God to encounter us before we leave or when we get home. But we know that the demands placed on us is so heavy that we barely get a moment to just say, oh man, God. Whew. Let's be real. This is life. For many of us, the pace of our lives very seldomly leaves room for God to truly encounter us in the way that we would think He wants to do it. Right? Yet, all of us have this desire that we want to go deeper. We want to learn more. We want to grow in our faith. We want time to get into the scriptures. We would love to do more Bible study. We'd love to grow in our faith. Yet the reality is that, man, life is busy. But what if we were so sensitive that we don't have to wait for the morning or the evening to encounter God, that God knows He's got the permission at any given point in our day for us to encounter Him. A few years ago, I read this book called Liturgy of the Ordinary. It's become one of my favorite books. And in the season we were in, Sean and I had just had kids, and we realized that pastoring a church is going to look very different because, contrary to what people believe, pastors don't just sit around, have tea all day, and wait for people to come with their problems so we can counsel them in the presence of the Holy Spirit in this building. Listen. I had someone the other day who was like, so you guys actually work like during the week? I'm like, yeah, bro. And then he found out we've got a staff. He's like, other people work here during the week. Oh, you thought it was just me? It's like, yeah. And so we realized life would look different. And this book happened to come at the right time because the author, her name is Tish Harrison Brown. She speaks about encountering God in these everyday moments. I'm just going to read you a short portion of what she says before I dig into it. She says, the crucible of our formation is in the monotony of our daily lives. In a culture that craves the big, the entertaining, the dramatic, and the shocking, sometimes literally, cultivating a life with space for silence and repetition is necessary for sustaining a life of faith. A few pages later, she says, the kind of spiritual life and disciplines needed to sustain the Christian life are quiet, repetitive, and ordinary. I often want to skip the boring daily stuff to get to the thrill of an edgy faith. But it's in the dailiness of Christian faith. The making the bed, the doing the dishes, the praying for our enemies, the reading the Bible, the quiet, the small, that God's transformation takes root and grows. And for me, that became so freeing that I don't have to wait for the big. I don't have to wait for Sunday. I don't have to wait for a home group or family group on a Wednesday, that I know that God has the permission at any given point when I'm making the bed, when I'm tending to my kids, when I'm on a date night with my wife, whatever, that God can invade that space and create a moment of encounter. So let me just help us with a couple of things. Two main thoughts I want to share with you if we are going to live these lives of everyday encounter. The first one is this. What we are going to need to learn is to become sensitive and aware to the Spirit of God and God's presence. To simply have an awareness that God doesn't live at number 2 Carter Street, SW5. This is not His address. And so we don't have to wait until we're here to meet with Him. If we become aware of God's ever-present presence, then we realize that, hang on, I don't need to wait for that. I can have that right here. You know what we need to learn, church? We need to learn to be resensitized to the presence of God. We need to learn to be resensitized that wherever I am, God is there. Sure. And wherever I am, God can meet me there. And that in the monotony, in the daily, in the driving between meetings, in all of these moments, that if I simply just am sensitive, then God can invade that and do something there. Yes. You know, for many of us, this is a challenge because a lot of our perspective needs to be challenged because we maybe grew up with this very religious perspective that God only lives at a certain place, or only dwells at a certain place, or only dwells among certain people. And so I can only really have an encounter when I'm here Or I can only really have an encounter when the pastor is leading me into it. When I'm going through a challenge in my personal life or in my marriage or work, that I have to wait for the pastor to lay hands and pray over me, because then God will hear it. But the same God who leads the leaders is the same God that leads us. That the same voice pastors hear is the same voice I can hear, right? That God can just meet us where we're at. Psalm 139 is such an incredible verse that we can cling on to. I can never escape your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. Where are we going to go to escape God's presence? And with that understanding, can we just reframe that for a second? Because it's a beautiful verse, but let's make that real for you and I. When I lie down at night and my thoughts are waging with anxiety and I'm feeling overwhelmed, you are there, right? When I'm traveling from one meeting to another in a different town and I feel rushed and I feel overwhelmed, guess what? God, you are there. When I'm sitting up at 2 a.m. breastfeeding my newborn baby, just longing for just a couple of minutes of shut-eye, God, you are there. I really feel like that's a prophetic word for some lady sitting in the front who happens to be married to the pastor, but that's not a big deal. I just sense that's a word. That's a word for someone. You forgot to flail your arms and go, I receive. Come on, man. Aren't you learning anything this weekend? God, when I'm working on my side hustle, trying to find ways to generate an income because I'm trying to make ends meet, you are there. God, when I'm dealing with clients who put demands on me that my capacity cannot match up with, God, you are there. When I'm at Emmanuel Private School dealing with some young kid named Levi who talks more than his vocabulary will allow him to, God, you are there. God, I pray that you are there. God, when my spouse and I are dealing and wrestling through some deep personal challenges, that God, you are there. Yes. Why? Because where are we going to run? Where can I go to escape your presence? At any given moment in our day, if we are simply aware and sensitive, the presence of God can meet us there and give wisdom and encouragement and uplift and comfort and strengthen if we are simply willing to allow Him to do that in those spaces. It's not like you walk into work and when you shut the door behind you, you leave God there. No, He's very much welcome in that space, in your meetings, in your conversations. He's very much welcome in the workshop, in those spaces. He's very much welcome on the plant or in the classroom. He's very much welcome there and can meet us there. We become aware and sensitive to God's presence. And when we do this, it changes how we encounter the small daily moments. Isn't that true? So firstly, let's become a bit more sensitive. Secondly, and here's where I want to camp for a little bit, we need to build altars of remembrance around some of these sacred encounters. We need to learn to build altars. You know why? Because so often we see God do incredible things, but we trust human memory way too much. Like coming from an ADHD person, I can tell you, I cannot trust my memory. And my wife knows this very well. No, I'll remember that. I don't have to write it down. And my wife has since grown smart. She goes, no, you just go. I'll message Sia. You will remember, or she will remind you. Like we trust our memory way too much. And so often we see God do incredible things and we have amazing encounters with Him. But because we failed to just build an altar around that, years later we forgot how faithful God was. We forgot how God comes through. And so once upon a time when we struggled and wrestled and God came through in a powerful way, rather than that altar reminding us of God's faithfulness, a couple of months later we find ourselves in a situation and we go back to stressing the same way we did and freaking out and panicked because we haven't learned to just look back and say, God, if you were faithful there, you'll be faithful there. And if you were faithful here, you'll be faithful there. And so we need to learn to build altars around these encounters. See, this was something that when you read the Old Testament, you'll see this time and time again where people build these altars. And like I said, obviously, because they were moving so much, it was just a way of remembering a significant moment. But I believe that you and I can learn from that principle. And if we can simply set up altars in our lives, And that looks different for everyone. Some people love to journal. Some people love to get tattoos. My wife. Some people love to take photographs of moments. Whatever that looks like for you, if we would simply be intentional to say, God, this is an altar moment. And I'm going to do what I need to do to remember your faithfulness here. This is an altar moment. I want to remember this conversation with this person. This is an altar moment. I want to go back and look back to this moment because you've defined something in me. Let me give you two quick examples of this. Genesis chapter 16, verse 13, with Hagar. You know the account of Hagar, Abraham's slave, who he impregnates, hoping to receive God's promise, and then realizes he made a mistake, and then decides that he's going to send her away because Sarah complains about it, and this is a big mess. He's created something, and Hagar leaves, and he sends her away with like a bottle of water and something, and it's a horrible account, really. Yet, God meets Hagar. It says this, thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. She also said, have I truly seen the one who sees me? So that well was named Beer Lahai Roy, which means well of the living one who sees me. And it can be found between Kadesh and Beret. What an amazing privilege to be able to, and this is incredible. I wish I had the time to unpack, but Hagar becomes one of the very first people recorded in Scripture to name God. Other than a time when God revealed himself as someone, she names, you are the God who sees me. What an incredible privilege that I've never seen this dimension to God. My master, who I was working for, happened to look like a godly man, yet raped me, had a kid, realized I was no use to him, sent me out, and as I sit there waiting for my son to die, this God sees me. And he speaks to me, and he met with me there. And that well, that place, that space was named after that encounter. Listen, how cool would it be if we could name places after encounters? Listen, South Africa would be very interesting. Did you know, Pastor Malcolm, I don't know if you know this, there's a place in the northwest named Twee Buffels met een skoot mors doodgeskiet fontein. You don't believe me? Listen, Google it. How many of you know this? In the northwest, and direct translation for those of you who don't understand, 2 buffalo shot dead with 1 shot fontaine. Listen, if I was a hunter and I did that, I'm naming that place that. Like, listen, no one's going to believe me. 2 buffalo, 1 shot, 1 bullet, pa. 2 buffels, 1 skoot mors doodgeskiet fontein. Listen, bro, you must come check what happened here. Imagine we had that privilege. Yet in these moments, these people had that privilege. Joshua 4 verse 19, the people crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped at Gilgal, just east of the Jericho, and it was there at Gilgal that Joshua piled up 12 stones taken from the Jordan River, and Joshua said to the Israelites, in future, your children will ask, what do these stones mean? And then you will tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. What an encounter. What an altar. Imagine some kid playing, some snot-nosed, scruffy little 9-year-old, and he's busy flicking stones on the water, and he comes to this pile of rocks, and he's thinking, yo, those are some nice stones, and he wants to take one to skip, and some guy's like, yeah, whoa. See, these stones you don't touch. Oh, Daddy, these are almost just stones. No, these aren't just stones. Come, I tell you what happened here so many years ago. At this very spot, I saw something that blew my mind. You see this water? It just opened up. And we wondered how we were going to get to the other side, but God did something. It's like, yo, Daddy, how did this happen? Let me tell you about this God, son, who did the impossible. What if our altars of encounter moments don't only become our witness, but the witness to our kids and the next generation, right? What if we just learn these principles? See, like I said, it's not just mountaintop moments. Let me tell you a recent altar moment that profoundly changed me. A few weeks ago, our daughter Annabelle had some challenges. I don't know what was wrong, but she just would not sleep, and she would not fall asleep without you holding her. So in between Shani's schedule and mine, We found ourselves having to juggle between this child who couldn't sleep by herself. And when you put her down for 5 minutes, she wakes up again and she starts screaming. And so it happened on a Wednesday. I normally prepare my sermons from home. And so on this Wednesday, Shani has quite a bit to finish in her work. And I need to prepare my sermon. And somehow Annabelle just will not give us a gap. And Shani's got her for a few moments so I can type. And then I take and Shani goes and writes. And I remember sitting on the corner of my bed and I'm rocking her just a little bit. And normally my rocking just starts gently, But as she cries and as she becomes niggly, that rocking turns into a bit of a violent, like you're starting to shake this child, And I'm thinking to myself, you moet nou slaap nou, ek moet nou, And for those of you task-driven people, when you've got something set before you, everything is a distraction. Everything blocks your path. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, I need to prep the sermon. Shani needs to write this book. And it's just so much pressure. And I was very frustrated. And on the corner of my bed, rocking my daughter, this moment, God just meets me there. And he said these words into my heart. Randy, this child is not an interruption. Just like that. And I had a paradigm shift. This child is not an interruption to my day. She's not like I'm trying to accomplish this and she's just trying to block me. No. This is my day. And for that moment, it just so happened that revelation coincided with Annabelle happening to fall asleep. That's how I know God was there. And so I'm holding Annabelle, and for the next 2.5 hours, I sit on the corner of my bed, watching my daughter sleep. Not a single care. Listen, I love you guys. But in that moment, I thought those people can preach to themselves on Sunday. That sermon will sort itself out. In this moment, I held Annabelle, and I just watched her sleep for 2.5 hours. God met me on the mountaintop of the corner of my bed. It wasn't a Sunday. There was no one around, not a Bible in sight. I wish I could say, no. Holding my daughter, who would not fall asleep. I had a mountaintop moment on my bed. See, these altars of remembrance, here's what they do for us, church. They help us hold on to God's faithfulness. They help us remember that this God we serve, this is not just theoretical. I've seen him work actively and practically. They help us build trust in the character of God. They help us remember that this God who we serve has such a love for us that he's willing to invade our day to show us who he is. It helps us lead the next generation with absolute confidence, one step closer toward God. Let's go back to Joshua. Let's go back to Hagar. Can you just imagine the stories for generations to come? That Hagar is playing with Ishmael somewhere and somehow comes across something that's reminiscent of that moment. And she can just tell him, yo, son, I wish you could know this God who sees you like he sees me. What? The stories for generations to come. See, these altars of remembrance, they help us remember God's faithfulness. May you and I never grow cold in our pursuit of God. And may we never grow complacent in our pursuit of God's encounters. I want to close off with this story. Andrew and Maria, very, very close friends of ours. I remember there was a season where they were freelancing. And they were working multiple jobs and doing some designs. And they were subcontracting for the church, so they did a lot of our designs. But I remember that there was a season in their lives where they came under some heavy financial stress. And I remember that there were times when Andrew had to sell cool drink bottles just to buy bread with like a handful of coins. Have you ever seen those? We often get frustrated behind those people who just like coins, and then they're like 20 cent, 20 cent, 20 cent, 20 cent. And you're just sitting there like, Jesus, help. And I remember that season in their lives. And then I remember when that season just shifted. And God just began to bless them. And my friend Andrew took a frame and he opened it up, and rather than putting a picture in there, he put a 20-cent coin. And it looks like this. I think I've got a picture up of it, if you guys aren't there. If you walk into their house, right through the front door towards the kitchen, that hangs on their wall. Just a 20-cent coin. And obviously that sparks curiosity. And so you come and you're like, dude, what's with the artwork by the Reserve Bank? It's like you don't do your own artwork anymore. Just gooi the bank's art on there. And Andrew will tell you the story of the time he had to count enough coins to buy bread for his kids and sell cool drink bottles. And then he will tell you stories of God's faithfulness and stories of how God has provided for them and stories how now they get to be a blessing unto others. But there was a season where they lived off that. See, I've seen no better example of an altar of remembrance than that. See, for many of us, we've got those moments, but they fail to become altars where we can look back to God's faithfulness. What could you do to set up an altar of remembrance? These aren't altars or shrines where we worship, don't get me wrong. These are simply altars that help us remember, sure, there was a time, There was a time when God did what we never expected him to do. There was a time when God moved. There was a time when God spoke. I'll never forget those words. There was a time when God acted. I've got on my computer, in a folder, an audio file that's about 4 minutes long of a prophecy given to me 11 years ago by Pastor Malcolm Baxter. That same file is on my email sent to my mom that she still has with her to this day. For me, that's an altar of remembrance. Doesn't have to be complicated. Doesn't have to be big. Doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. It's something that is sacred to you, that you know. I'm going to pass that audio clip on to my son one day. I don't care if he cares about it. He needs to know what God has done in his dad's life. Psalm chapter 16. You will show me the way of life and grant me the joy of your presence and the pleasure of living with you forever. What if, instead of this pressure of trying to get into the faith and hear from God and be a good Christian, pray for people and all of this, what if we simply just experience the joy of God's presence? That God, yes, my work frustrates me so much, but it's so good that you are here. In my frustration, you are here. That God, you know how frustrating parenting can get. And you can barely have an adult conversation for 2 straight minutes without some minion just telling you a story that has nothing to do with anything. Jesus, help me. But God, your presence is in my home. What would it look like if we just lived in the presence of God, becoming sensitive to his ever-present presence? And when we have a moment, seeing it and being so intentional that we build an altar so we can look back towards his faithfulness. Wouldn't that be encouraging? Wouldn't that grow your faith a bit? Wouldn't that give you a confidence that, no matter what happens now, you know what? I've experienced God there, and there. I'll continue to experience him there. When you are faced with the challenge that, yes, when everyone's freaking